Welcome to day 4 of Painting the Wilderness Seascapes, my friend. Today we're zooming out for a scenic Cliffside Waves scene where we're gonna paint some cliffs and then we're going to paint the ocean kind of crashing up against the cliffs, but instead of getting right up close, we're going to zoom all the way out, almost as if this is a shot from a drone, or as if you're sitting on a nearby cliff and looking down at the ocean below. That's the kind of scene that we're going to paint today. And so we're gonna practice lots of composition and also layering and contrast, as kind of always as we're practicing these seascapes. So I really hope you like this one. All right, so one of the first things that you need to know about this project is I didn't love how it came out. I love the idea of it. I love the idea of a soft but colorful sunset and background and using those careful layers to build a cliffside ocean piece. I really love that idea. And I loved specific aspects of this tutorial of painting this painting. But I didn't love the end result, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we go along. So that was just to kind of preface. Let's get started painting, though. You will hopefully have, a joyful experience painting this with me. So we're going to start with the wet on wet technique, and the first thing we're going to do is lay down the first layer of color in the sky. So I have some phthalo turquoise on my palette, and I just added some Quin Rose to the phthalo turquoise to get kind of like a neutral, warm violet. And as you can see, the violet is very, very light value, meaning it is very watery. So I'm using watery paint on top of wet paper because I really want a light layer. I want a very luminous layer. Immediately under the violet, I'm putting down some watery phthalo turquoise. I think I even put a little bit of Prussian blue in there. Just a light, very watery blue. And then I took a fairly light, although this one has a little bit more pigment in it, a fairly light value yellow ochre, and layered it in there just in that bottom corner. So as I'm kind of mixing these 3 sections, I want to be careful not to just kind of combine all of them because all together it would probably make some kind of brown. So I want to use water as kind of a buffer between 2 different colors, and it's okay if it's fairly light. So while this layer is still wet, I'm also going to layer on 3 colors for the ocean. The first layer is that warm violet color again, and then we're going to do some Prussian blue and a phthalo turquoise. The most important thing to remember about this first layer of the ocean is that the bottom of the gradient, right, we're making like a 3-color gradient, the bottom of the paper should be the darkest. And then, so we're using phthalo turquoise, again, we're using phthalo turquoise and just a little bit of Prussian blue. And then using either a thirsty brush, so a clean, damp brush, or using water as kind of like a buffer to, make sure that the turquoise doesn't get too unruly, make sure that the colors are still visible, but there's also some light spaces in between the colors. This is an opportunity for you to just kind of dance across the page with your paintbrush. I added a little bit more yellow at the top. That was kind of a last minute decision. And, you can use a thirsty brush to reveal more white space of the paper. It doesn't really matter. The most important thing is that we have that yellow in that bottom corner of the sky, kind of, glowing out. And then the sea goes violet, then, lighter turquoise, and then a fairly dark turquoise blue. So now we're going to focus specifically on the sky, and I put down a piece of tape separating the sky from the ocean. So the sky is going to start obviously like at the top of that piece of tape. And so I got the sky wet, and now we're going to add some kind of like grayish purple clouds. The key with adding clouds like this and not letting them get so unruly that they're just like all over the place is to get your page wet and then wait for a little bit. It's also to make sure that the pigment that you're using isn't like super watery. So I just added a little bit of Payne's gray to the violet that I was already using, and that made it kind of this like darker gray violet. And in order to get that kind of blurry effect while still maintaining the shape of the clouds, we want the pigment not to have tons of water in it, and we want the paper to be drying. So it's still wet, but it's also drying. And so the way to get that is to, wet your paper and then wait for a few minutes or a few seconds. And then I'm just gonna add some dimension to these clouds by, again, waiting for a few minutes for the clouds to kind of dry, but not all the way. And then I'm putting some Payne's gray just honestly randomly kind of along the bottom of the clouds, and that's again to add dimension. It's worth noting that if I were to do this piece again, I probably wouldn't have added the clouds because I do think at the end of the day it makes it kind of busy, but I think it's a fun exercise to practice painting clouds like this. And if it's very messy, if you don't get defined clouds, if you find it difficult, honestly anything you find difficult, it's okay. Remember, this is difficult. Like, we are practicing simple techniques, but simple doesn't always mean easy, right? And in addition to practicing these techniques, you're also practicing making uncertain marks and doing things even if you know you might not get it right. So I'm happy that you're here. I'm proud of you, no matter what your clouds look like. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is paint the mountain layers. Obviously, we let the sky dry all the way, and now I'm using kind of like a mid-value Payne's gray. So it's fairly pigmented, but not super pigmented. I'm using kind of a mid-value Payne's gray to paint the back mountain. And I showed you my paintbrush going fairly slow because it's important for you to know I don't really have a rhyme or reason as to why I'm shaping it the way that it is. Mostly, I'm just kind of like doing an angle, starting at the top and moving down at a choppy angle, and then I'm just going down the shoreline. And this mountain is going to be covered up by another darker mountain, so it's not as important that all of it is super visible, right? So I'm just going to dry that really quickly, and then this time I'm using a bigger brush because I'm painting a slightly bigger mountain. And my Payne's gray is very, very pigmented, right? It's not like as pigmented as it could be. There's still a little bit of water in it, but it's still darker. And you get paint to be darker that way by adding more, having the water to paint ratio be more in paint's favor. So I'm adding this second mountain layer right on top, and I want like the very tip of the mountain layer kind of in that bottom right-hand corner. I want it to kind of extend out into the ocean. And so that's what I'm doing. And again, these strokes are slow, right? These strokes are slow, not because I'm being super deliberate, but because I'm being very uncertain, and that's okay. It's okay not really to know where things are going. And it is worth knowing for you that the mountain is part of, if I could do this over again, I would probably do the mountain over again and not make the shape. So the shape just kind of looks wonky to me after looking at it now. But it still looks like a mountain, right? I still think it looks like a mountain that's jutting out of the water. And so regardless of what your mountain shape turns out, the most important thing to remember is that, we want it to kind of be jutting into the ocean, and that we want the edges to look fairly rough, right? We don't want it to look very smooth because this is a mountain. So before that layer dried, I did just add a little bit more darker value in some areas to give it a little bit of texture. And then I let it dry all the way. So we have that first layer of the mountain. We have it covering up that first layer of the ocean. Now I'm going to add a little bit more texture to the ocean by using a very, very light value phthalo turquoise in kind of loose horizontal strokes, basically to add waves. So it's like I'm adding the texture of waves to the ocean. And we are looking at the ocean as if from a drone or from a very high position, right? Like maybe we're on another cliff, or maybe we're in a plane or something like that. That's kind of the perspective that we're looking at here. And so the waves don't have to be perfect. They don't have to be very specific. Really, I'm just trying to capture like these loose zigzag horizontal strokes, but going in slightly different directions too, because the current of the ocean, there are many of them, right? It doesn't go in exactly the same way. And so that's something that's important to think about. This part was scary for me. Putting down wet on dry waves is always scary for me. But, one nice thing about this project is that the ocean is not the only thing that's detailed. So, yes, you are adding detail to the ocean that people are going to be able to see and they're going to be able to critique. And maybe it even, it doesn't look exactly like what you'd imagine faraway ocean waves would look like. But because we are putting lots of other details all over the mountain and in the ocean when we add the white gouache, it's okay. So we have that first layer of kind of glazed turquoise waves, right? And now we're going to add just a slightly darker layer of waves. So I'm using Payne's gray, but I'm adding a lot of water to it. And mostly these waves are along the bottom. And this is just to emphasize that gradient that we have going on, right? Where the top of the ocean is lighter because that's where the sun is reflecting off of it. And the bottom of the ocean that's closest to the mountain, is a little bit darker. So now I'm going to use Payne's gray, very, very pigmented Payne's gray, as black. And this is where we're going to paint in, I guess, just a few rocks. Now, because our perspective is from like the perspective of a drone, right? We're far away. These rocks are tiny. But when you're painting rocks in the ocean, there's just pretty much one thing to remember. The bottom is always going to be flat, and that's because the part of the rock that you can see in the ocean is sticking up out of the ocean, right? So it looks like the bottom of the rock is flat, but really it's just that the ocean surface is covering the other part. But that's typically just the only rule that I think about when I'm painting rocks. I do recommend painting them in clusters, like in clumps, as opposed to one at a time. I thought to myself, okay, I'm going to paint a group of 3 here, and then I'm going to paint a group of 5 here, and I'm going to make some of them tiny, and I'm going to make some of them larger. As long as you kind of keep them varied and different, they should look pretty good. And so I just put those rocks all along the shoreline. And now I'm adding crags to the mountain. And the way that I'm doing that is by wet on dry zigzags, right? So I'm just using a size 2 brush and fairly light value Payne's gray, although it's still enough that you can see it. And I'm going up and down and up and down, and then I'm going a little bit side to side and off to an angle. Basically, I'm just creating crags and shadows and cracks on this mountain, on this cliff, so that it looks a little more realistic. You really can't go wrong here. Adding crags on a mountain can be so therapeutic because it is just kind of leaning into your imperfection and, letting go of what you imagine what it should be like, and just kind of paint, right? Lean into that uncertainty. So the very last thing that we're going to do for this piece is to add the sea foam with gouache. So we're not adding tons of water to the gouache, again, using it more as like a paste. And I'm going to be sure to just kind of gently brush some sea foam along the shoreline, maybe kind of make some waves in the shoreline, along the bottom of those rocks. And then I'm just kind of adding the gouache definitely along the shoreline where I know that it is, where I know that the ocean is kind of, lapping up onto that shore or up against the cliff. But then also, in a few scattered places throughout. And that's it. I'm done. This is the Cliffside Waves project. And like I said at the beginning, if I could change a few things, I would. And I intentionally didn't. I several times thought, I think I'm just going to repaint this and have this be like a blooper reel thing. But I intentionally decided to keep it as the main video for day 4 because I want you to know, I want you to see that, even though I'm proud and had fun during a lot of this painting, the end result was not my favorite. It's not. I think there are lots of things that I would have done differently. And if I decide to do it again, maybe I will do differently. But I can still take away those tiny moments of wonder, right? There are still those tiny moments like when I put the Payne's layer Payne's gray layer on the clouds, adding dimension to it, that was super fun to me. When I was making the gradient in the ocean and in the sky, that was really fun for me. I also really loved adding the crags, and so that's a big part of the reason why I want you to think about all the things you loved. Because when you can remember all the things you loved about a painting, then even if you don't love the end result, that's just one part of the journey, right? The end result is just one part of this path that you've been on. And you can discover so many more parts that were beautiful and worth remembering and helped you grow as an artist. So, with that, let's talk about our loved and learned for day 4 for Cliffside Waves. As I mentioned before, I really, really loved like the blend of colors going from the sky down to the ocean. I loved that kind of gradient that we created. I really loved the texture in the clouds and the texture on the mountains. I really love how texture in general is something in this piece that played a part, right? Where we layered on not very many layers, right? We didn't paint very many layers, but by adding just a few of those details, like the glazed the waves on top of the ocean, the sea foam on top of the waves, the little rocks, it kind of ties everything together so it does look like a complete scene. And so like those little details are important to think about and to, weigh in your mind, is it something that's worth pursuing or not? So those are the things that I loved. I also loved the subtle blend of the yellow in the sky. I always loved that. And then some of the things that I learned are, once again, imperfections are okay. Trust that you're not going to ruin anything. Even if you start painting and it's not exactly what you hoped, you didn't ruin it. You just discovered a new path. And maybe this path isn't the one you want to be on, but that's still knowledge that you learned. I think that another thing I learned, that building layers, like slow layers, builds contrast, and slow layers helps really simple pieces like this come together. And then the last thing I wrote about is use your shaky hands to your advantage, right? Like when we made those crags and the waves, it's okay to be imperfect. It's okay not to know what you're painting. It's okay for your hand to shake. That sometimes just adds to the effect. Thanks for painting with me.